So what do we mean by the Upstander Ripple Effect?
Stand up against hate and prejudice, even if it does not affect you.
From moral dilemmas in today's headlines, upstanders who rose for justice, and stories of survival.
Be prepared to walk away from this conversation inspired and motivated. Hello, everyone. I am Kevin Aldridge, and I'd like to welcome you to the 11th episode of the Upstander Ripple Effect. And in today's episode, we're going to be focusing on the topic of resilience. And as you can see, I'm alone here in the studio. So we've got a slightly different setup this episode because my good friend and co-host on the podcast, Jackie Congedo, is actually in Israel right now attending a conference for CEOs of Holocaust museums from all around the world. And so she's going to talk about that in just a moment. And give you an idea of what she's doing, what she's seeing while she's there in Israel. But we've got a lot of other current events and things that are going on that we're going to kind of roll into that, Jackie, here in just a few minutes. And I thought we might just start out this week's episode by talking about some of the things that we're seeing on the national level in terms of some of the erasure of history that we're seeing that's a part of the Trump administration's quote unquote crackdown or banning of DEI initiatives. And we've even seen this now starting to creep into and infiltrate even into the Department of Defense, where we saw just this week the histories of veterans like Jackie Robinson even being taken down from the DOD's website. Now that has since been changed and has been restored, along with I think we have some other communities that saw similar types of erasure. And you can expound on that, Jackie, but it's a big concern to see our federal government, going to this measure to erase key figures and key contributors to the history of our country from non-white communities. And I think it sends just a very, very chilling message to those of us who do care about diversity and inclusion.
Yeah. So first off, Kevin, thank you for holding down the fort in Cincinnati. It's great to be with you and see you over the screen. And it is now 7:20 p.m. in Jerusalem, and I'm actually in the little office area of the hotel where we've been staying. Going to be headed out to board a plane in Tel Aviv back to the States here shortly. But yeah, happy to share a little bit more sort of about, talk about reflections on resilience related to the time I've been spending here over the last couple of days. But yeah, I mean, I think this is pretty, actually, there was a lot of talk about this here among Holocaust educators, among, leadership at Holocaust museums, because along with, the information about Jackie Robinson and other veterans, and also, suicide awareness, prevention awareness, and, cancer awareness, sexual assault, September 11th, and indeed articles featuring testimony from survivors, Holocaust survivors, I believe related to Holocaust Remembrance Day, were taken down off the Pentagon's website. And I think it's good that they were restored. But the question is, the question I'm asking myself is, to your point, Kevin, like what made anybody think this was a good idea to begin with? And what kind of a message does this send? I think in an era when a lot of what we've been talking about over the last week is, survivors are leaving us. And in so many of these people, whether that's Jackie Robinson or anyone else, like they're not around to tell their stories. And so, access to this kind of information about our history and about where we've come from is really important. And, the way we allow it to help us learn to, to lead better lives and build stronger communities today, I think is really, really essential. So, I'd like to think that this was some kind of unintended consequence of, but it seems like this was a pretty deliberate, um, as part of this sort of sweeping measures to crack down on DEI or to, to limit what's out there related to certain DEI topics.
Yeah, it seems to me that this administration is pushing for that anything that is non-white is considered to be DEI and therefore needs to be eliminated from any institution that is receiving government funding. And I think that that is just a horrible idea and a horrible premise to proceed from. I've argued for years that part of the problem that I have somewhat with the terminology of Black history is that Black history is American history. That's one of the things that I've always argued about it. Like even the necessity to place Black in front of history says that there's something about our reluctance overall to include this as a part of what is the American story, what is the story of the world. And it seems like that this administration is dead set on trying to eliminate those aspects of American history from the telling, mainly because they're not parts of our history that are anything that you want to be proud of in terms of how our nation and people who were living at that time conducted themselves. But I think why they're an important part of our country's story is not because we want to overly dwell on the worst times, but how we were able to overcome those times and become a better country and a better nation. And I think it's just a very cynical way to look at it, to say, hey, we want to get rid of these parts of history because we don't like how how it makes us look or how it makes us feel, or this insane notion that teaching this history somehow teaches people to hate our country I just think is just a bad premise to proceed from. And I think that is what this administration has been trying to sell to people, is that, truth telling and telling the history of this country makes people hate this country. No, what makes people upset and disappointed in our country is exactly this type of thing that we see this current administration doing.
Yeah. I mean, I think also it's just, it's this sort of, hyper aggressive, sweeping reforms, if you want to call them that, that I also just think isn't particularly helpful, right? It's not to say that there hasn't been challenges related to how we have thought from a contemporary standpoint about, what not the value of things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, but certainly the implementation of those frameworks, I think, has in some cases actually been exclusive for groups such as Jews and others. And so, there's no doubt that wasn't a perfect framework, and there was improvement that I think was really sorely needed, especially when you think about the landscape of our college campuses and, what's been happening in those places recently. But I think this whole throw the baby with the bathwater out is really, it's like the pendulum swinging way to the other way isn't helpful either. Certainly. I think that's kind of an understatement. And so, I'm in the camp of hoping that we can just kind of correct and get somewhere back to the center where we can celebrate what makes our country unique and rich and diverse. And those are things like the experiences and the contributions of people like Jackie Robinson and Holocaust survivors and, people who have come from different places with different sets of strengths and contributed in amazing ways and have wonderful stories to tell about what it means to be an American. And I think that, hopefully there is, continues to be sort of appropriate corrections for these things. I mean, it is concerning though, when you see that it's part of sort of a broader wholesale elimination of anything related to, I mean, you just get yourself in trouble because things like this get, swept up in an attempt to sort of course correct something that really legitimately, I think, needs some course correction. But you start axing left and right, and inevitably this is what happens. And that sends a really, it's hard to take back the hurt that causes, even once the content is restored.
Yeah, and in some cases, the content is not being restored, as we've seen. The Black Lives Matter Plaza being dug up and destroyed there in Washington D.C., and again, taking up what was seen as a symbol of unity and recognition that again, we're trying to change for the better. Sends a strong message again. I think for all of the talk about ferreting out, government waste and abuse, and spend $650,000 to tear up, Black Lives Matter Plaza. I wish somebody could explain to me how that's good government and good stewardship of tax dollars to spend that type of money to remove something that, quite frankly, was more uplifting than it was divisive. Again, I think it's just emblematic of the wrong-headed thinking that we're seeing, unfortunately, coming from our highest levels of government.
Yeah, I mean, this is. I think it's just also important to think about the, like I was saying, the kind of message that sends. And I think things like that aren't necessarily causing any problems. And to your point, Kevin, may be a source of unity and pride. Literally digging those things up. If there's no problem, like what can be the reason for that, right? I'm not trying to make any assumptions here, but there are definitely certain messages that are sent about what's okay and what's not okay, about what we stand for, what we don't, what we sort of commonly understand as shared values in this country, and what we don't. And so, that's the kind of thing that I think, is causing a lot of pain right now. And when I think about the history, I think that the more these kinds of things are normalized, the more we hear and see, these sorts of things take place, and they continue to take place. And, it's more and more aggressive in terms of corrections and, content that's coming down, and expressions of, identity are being dug up. I think we just want to look out for an environment where that gets normalized, and where people are used to it, because that's the first step.
Mm-hmm. For sure, and I think I'm glad that there was outrage over the Jackie Robinson situation, to the point where they had to course correct on that and put that back. I'm not going to be as generous as you in thinking that it might have been some sort of good natured oversight, but here I just think that there needs to be more pushback from the public on these types of things, because this is not the type of environment that we want to create. I mean, think about this. Here you have a president who vehemently argued against the taking down of Confederate statues. And we know what the Confederacy represented in the United States, particularly as it pertains to Black people and particularly Black lives. So you have a president who argues for the preservation of that, but endorses the destruction of a monument to Black lives. What message do you think that sends, that you'll fight for monuments depicted to people who took Black lives, but an actual monument celebrating Black lives, you want that dug up? I really want people who are listening to this to think about that and the message that it sends, and those who want to defend this administration and some of their thought processes. Really take a minute to think about that. Argue for the preservation of conservative monuments, dig up a monument to Black lives. That sends a pretty clear message to me about how those individuals think about these sorts of things.
Yeah, and I think this is where, like, I think there is a middle ground here where, there's an argument. Sorry if you hear background noise. That's just the hustle and bustle of dinner time in Jerusalem. Um, but
There's a siren.
oh, there's a siren.
Yes.
I gotta go. I gotta go.
So close down.
Okay.
That's they're sheltering.
Got it. Wow.
Really? She might be back.
All right.
Kevin, sorry about that.
You don't have, listen.
This is
You don't have to apologize, my friend. I'm just glad you're okay.
the reality. This is so we want to talk about resilience. Like there's people singing now because everybody's okay. Is that what they're doing out there? It's wild over here. I mean, that's the reality for the lived experience for Israelis every day. And the siren goes off. Literally, the bellhop, like the concierge, came in and was like, "We gotta go now," which is why I just shut the laptop. And we went down like 3 floors into the cellar of the hotel where there's a safe room. And we're in there with, people who are staying here, people who are probably Israelis who are visiting, others, people who are staying here, their guests, children. I was right next to this like mother carrying her like 3-month-old baby, who was just asleep the whole time. And then another little girl who was probably about 7 or 8, who was in tears, and her mom was trying to explain to her that it was going to be okay and it's all okay. And I think that's the complexity. Like that's what's so heavy about this whole thing, right? Is that people are having to, and yet life continues, right? Mm-hmm. Like here I am back on the on with you, and people are going back to eat their dinner in the lobby, and people are back in their rooms, and so who knows when this is going to happen again. I'm trying to decide now if I have to catch an hour car ride to Tel Aviv to get to the airport here in 30 minutes. And I think the protocol, I was just asking about the protocol, like if there's sirens that go off on the way to the airport, I think you have to get out of the car and lay flat on the side of the road.
Wow.
And it's pouring here. So I think it's very easy for people to think that, this is like those people over there that, and I also just want to acknowledge that it's the weight of, having to at any moment take shelter. Mm-hmm. But it's also the weight, I think, for a society, and we've heard this so much since we've been here, that it feels so heavy. I mean, the society, people here are so heavy. They're resilient. They are so resilient, but they feel completely weighed down by the magnitude of what's going on. And they know that on the other side of this, there are people losing their lives, on both sides of this. We met with a mother and father who, by the way, was one of the people who works with the claims conference. So back up, we're in Israel because I'm meeting with other CEOs of Holocaust organizations all over the world. So, everybody from Argentina to Paris to Amsterdam, to Australia, a number of folks in the US. And we're here just talking about, the fact that we're trying to do this work in a moment that is sort of unprecedented. In the wake of the attacks of October 7th, in the middle of a war, with implications for Holocaust education, right? And trying to really figure out what our role should be in dealing with forms of contemporary antisemitism and it's also just so important, and it's so palpable here that while there has been, continuity of Jews living in this land for thousands of years, there are many, many people here who are Holocaust survivors or descendants of survivors. I mean, it's pervasive. And so, talk about resilience, like just about everybody here has a connection to the Holocaust, a personal connection to the Holocaust. And, one of the Holocaust educators at Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Israel, now is working with the Claims Conference, which is the nonprofit that helps to like negotiate and disperse funding from the German government to Holocaust survivors and for Holocaust education. So this man who's been with us the whole time, helping to kind of lead the tours and managing logistics. We actually one evening sat down with him at his home. He and his wife. They have 4 beautiful children. Had 4 beautiful children. Pictures all over their home. I mean, it's like a home you would go in, anywhere in Cincinnati. And we sat down and he talked about how his son at 20 years old was killed on October 7th. He was in the Army. He was part of a unit that is a search and rescue unit. And his job was to really look over new recruits. And so they were manning these posts at, southern Israel at the Gaza border on October 7th. And he died as, Hamas fighters, terrorists, came over in boats, armed, certainly more than he was. And he died because there was an RPG that was fired at him, and he and 2 others. And he held them off for a half hour. And because of that, the 2 villages, they're called kibbutzim, right? The sort of communal villages in southern Israel that we've heard a lot about. The 2 villages that were right nearby to his post were able to lock their gates. People were able to get into safe rooms, and nobody died in those villages. And we know that hundreds of lives were taken brutally that day, and so many captured. And so he saved a lot of lives. And to listen to his mother and his father talk about how this was the kind of person who did everything he could to reach across differences, who had the biggest heart for shared humanity, who, there are Druze, members of, the Druze community that serve in the IDF, worked with all kinds of Druze soldiers to help equip them and hear them and see them. And he just was the kind of person who cared deeply about other human beings. And even his family, I mean, I know I'm going on and on here, but this I feel like is really important. Mm-hmm. During the Shiva, sort of the Jewish mourning ritual in the wake of when someone dies, you have the funeral, the burial, and then you sit Shiva with the family, which means people come and they pay their respects and they come to the house and they sit with you for anywhere from, a week to 2 weeks and sometimes even more than that. And on the second day of the Shiva, his mother, the soldier's mother, heard about in a nearby Palestinian village. There was, this is in the wake of October 7th, so the whole country was basically in lockdown. And in this nearby Palestinian village, there was a woman who I think they were on like a shared WhatsApp group, and so they knew what was going on in each other's neighborhoods. And there was a woman who was pregnant. She was going to have to figure out how to give birth, and she couldn't couldn't necessarily had questions about whether she could access a hospital. And this mother, grieving the loss of her firstborn son at 20 years old, finds it in herself to write a letter to the people in this village and say, my heart's with you. I know we're all hurting. I can't fix it. I don't know how to fix it, but all I know to do is to tell you that I see you and I feel you. And even through my grief and my pain, I know that you are grieving and in pain too. And we all just want, a different reality than what we have. And because of that, the Palestinian community sent dates. So in the Middle East, there's dates everywhere, like literally, the dried fruit. And these are, often, particularly in like Muslim custom, a gesture of friendship. And warmth and hospitality. And in this case, it was condolences. And so I got to tell you, Kevin, that was so, the weight of that, just the fact that like there are so many everyday people who just want to be able to live safely, and that's on both sides of this.
Yeah.
Who are trying to figure out how to do that in the midst of a seemingly intractable, impossible situation. And but I can tell you that the resilience of the Israeli people, and that's not by accident. That's because for thousands of years, Jews have been chased out, persecuted, and expelled, and all the other terrible things, and through all of that, have the commitment to identity and the perseverance to live, to choose life. And so, you've got a nation of Holocaust survivors who are in and out of bomb shelters, who are on the front lines of this conflict. They're not calling the shots. They're not making the orders.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, but here they are. And it's really actually something to witness and to be part of. So anyway, on the topic of resilience, I feel like there's just so much to share. I mean, we were at a Holocaust museum, visiting one of the Holocaust museums in Israel. So basically an education center. And this was on Tuesday, right? And so there was more fighting that broke out on Tuesday after 2 months of a ceasefire. And so we were supposed to go all the way to the south. We were going to be seeing some of, the aftermath of the October 7th attacks in the south. That was quickly off the itinerary because of the active conflict that had picked up again. And so we went halfway south and we stopped at this education center, and we were experiencing, their student tour and what they do with students. And they have virtual reality headsets that they use for student education, where it actually takes students on a virtual experience at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Very powerful. And it occurred to me, because before we had gone into the museum, the director had said, listen, it's not a big deal, but if the siren goes off, like one just did here, I'm going to have to lead you to our safe room. It's fine. Just follow me. Like, we have a little bit, we have time, a minute and a half. It's literally, because we're talking about Israel, a state of like the size of Delaware, or New Jersey. I mean, it's a very small state. And we're in this virtual reality thing. And I'm thinking to myself, what happens, we're learning about the Holocaust in Israel, and a siren goes off and you have to take shelter, and you're like coming out of a virtual experience at a literal death camp. Right. It's like, so, I mean, hold that.
Yeah.
Like, and then people are just, you go to the market at night and people are out celebrating and people are out having dinner and the shops are open. I've got my, tea that I brought home. I got some really good tea for you, by the way, as a souvenir. And so it's like, yeah. And I think we're all holding, the whole society is holding that for many people. It's not life as usual. It's not business as usual when these things happen either, right? That there are people who are dying in this, and that's on, like I said, on both sides. So it's so new. I don't even know that I have the words, but I'm just sort of sharing them with you as they come to me.
Yeah.
And I don't want to forget where we were related to the important conversation on the domestic front, but to add a little context for why I just had to ghost everybody for about 15 minutes there. That's the situation here.
Well, I think it was important, and thank you first for sharing all of that, because I think it's important for our audience and for people to hear that story and that perspective. I was talking with Ann, our producer, in between, during that time that you were away, and I just said, my God, most Americans can't even imagine what that's like. And that's how quickly things can turn on a dime. If you're living there in Israel, it's like 1 minute, hey, we're having a conversation, on a completely different topic, on the podcast. And then the next minute, you're taking shelter because you don't know what might happen next. And, I think sometimes when we sit back in the comfort and security of the United States and debate these issues that are taking place thousands of miles away from here, there's that perspective that's missing, the perspective that you shared of what people on both sides of this conflict are living every day. And I think that with that, it should bring some humility, to those of us who are not living that reality every day, to say, yeah, we have our opinions. We think we know what we know about the information, but that's very different than living in the reality of what that is every day, and not just from a political or governmental standpoint, but as you said, from the lives of everyday people who are not calling the shots, but yet and still have to live under this, who've lost loved ones, who have to find a way to carry on, normally in the midst of completely abnormal circumstances, right? And that's just, quite frankly, something that most of us can't even imagine. And so even just that 5 to 10 minute period just kind of made me reflect, and I think humbled me on in a lot of ways, to just say, you know one, sort of selfishly saying, man, we're blessed here that we, at least at present, aren't worried about and living under those types of things. And then it also, one, made me concerned for my friend, but then also just to think about all of the other folks there who have to live under that threat daily. And it ought to inspire and encourage all of us to play whatever part or lend whatever voice that we can to figure out a way to try to find some solution that stops the bombing, that stops the killing, that somehow or another finds some kind of resolution where people can live their lives, right? And
So it is so incredibly challenging. I mean, right now you have a situation where there was a ceasefire in place, that fell apart. Things weren't proceeding as some say they should have been. No more hostages were coming home. You still have, after how many months has it been? How many years? At this point, innocent people who were ripped out of their beds in the middle of the day, held hostage. Interestingly, Israelis insist on the language kidnapped and not hostage, which is, I think, kind of an interesting distinction from how we think about it in the United States and how we talk about it. But the problem is that there's been such a status quo related to Hamas and their leadership, if you want to call it that, in Gaza, that it's just untenable. It's untenable for Israelis to say we're going to go back to that, because that looks like this at the best case scenario, worst case scenario, another October 7. And so there's this sort of every Israeli I've spoken with, everyone wants this to be over, like more than anything. I talked to one of the Holocaust educators in Israel whose son was in Gaza for 4 months at a time. Couldn't talk to him for 4 months. Had no idea where he was, if he was alive, in the army. And so everybody wants this to end. I think the problem is that Israelis refuse to go back to a place where they have they're in the same situation where this is, and I don't know that we could expect that any other legitimate nation with a right to defend itself would accept that kind of a status quo. So, but in the midst of war, right, people are dying, and that's horrific. And that's the weight I'm talking about. That's the weight of the soldier's mother who is holding, the humanity of the people on the other side of this while she's grieving her son. Like, you just feel the burden that people are walking around with here.
yeah,
Because, you can talk about the kind of security that keeps you alive, and then you can talk about like the kind of security that keeps your humanity alive.
yeah,
And those things are in tension all the time here, and it's such a heavy weight.
yeah.
So, but the resilience, I mean, last night, I sat at dinner next to one of the, what's sort of, the now become known as one of the twins who Dr. Mengele, had tortured essentially during the Holocaust. These were twins who were used in medical experiments. It's not even probably the right way to say that, but just really, some of the most horrific things you can imagine. And she's in her 80s now, and she's sitting next to me, eating her salmon dinner, talking about her grandkids. I mean, and I couldn't even hold the resilience it takes. She's got a granddaughter in the army. It's just unbelievable. And I think that's really hopeful when you think about, people facing adversity and being able to manage in their everyday lives, even through that adversity. It's remarkable. So yeah, it's been invigorating in all those ways, but definitely really challenging. And I'm really glad that I was here to witness it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, thank you for sharing that and bringing that, humanity. And I think that's why I believe in so strongly what we do here and sort of what I do professionally, because I think that, a lot of what we're seeing is sort of like our failure to be able to communicate and to be able to see the humanity in one another. Because I think when that breaks down and we find ourselves in that place, this is what we're sort of left with. We're sort of left with war and conflict and things of that nature. And I think all of that stems from a failure for us to be able to talk to one another, to see sort of the humanity in another, and to sort of understand and value, another person's story. And so I think by being able to share stories in this format, for you to be able to share the stories and things that you hear, that you're hearing there on the ground, I hope it challenges all of us to take a minute and pause and tap into our humanity and listen to what you shared and say, how can I be a better communicator around these issues and others, so that, we don't find ourselves in a position where we're diving on the side of the roads or ducking into shelters to, avoid bombs, because that's what it's left with when we get to the place where we can no longer talk to each other, in functional and reasonable and diplomatic ways that can allow us.
I'll also just totally, I don't mean to interrupt you, Kevin.
Yeah, no, go ahead. For sure.
I was just going to say, I think, and I think that there is this very real feeling here that anti-Semitism is real and it's present. And I'm not talking about people who, care deeply about human rights, don't really know the issues, don't really know the context, don't know the history, don't know the reality. I'm talking about a very explicit threat to Jews. Half of all global Jews live in Israel. Half. So any threat, to Israel, an existential threat to Israel is an existential threat to the Jewish people, is the reality. I mean, that's not a value judgment. That's just the facts. And so, and there is a dedicated strain here that when I'm talking about, this conflict, that has made it very clear that they don't believe in Israel's legitimacy. They don't believe that Jews have a place in the Middle East. They don't believe that Jews belong here. And they don't believe that Jews should be here. And despite the history that says otherwise. And so that's the kind of thing that's very hard to talk through.
Yeah.
When the negotiating line is your legitimacy and your survival and your right to exist. And, that's a tough one. So I think to your point, most people on both sides of this want to be able to just drop their kids off at school, cook dinner for their families, read their kids a book before they go to bed, and wake up the next morning and do it all over again. Yeah. Most people just want that. And so if you've listened to the last episode, Kevin and I so much going on in the world these days that we can't even get to like the testimonies that we want to share. So next time we will do that. Promise this time, but on the tone of see somebody else and, how do we have these conversations? Promise I didn't cue you up for this, but so this is the soldier. This is the 20-year-old child who was killed that day. And this is what his parents are handing out when they talk to people. And you know what's inside? 2 instant packets of coffee. And that's because their son had a knack for connecting with people and for seeing the humanity in somebody else and for caring enough about another human being with a different story to ask about that story, to want to know more about it. The reason it's coffee is because he was sort of known for these, long evenings where he would go and, when his fellow soldiers, Druze, Israeli, whoever, were on their posts, he would not sleep and he would drink coffee and he would go talk to them. And he would try and unpack, like, what's going on with you? What's your journey? What's your story? Really, listening to really hear them and see them. And so in the wake of his death, the Turkish coffee company in Israel worked with this family to put these together. And now they're handing them out. And they're like, in honor of our son, go have a cup of coffee with someone who thinks differently than you, who looks differently than you, who has another story to share, and hear their story. Because when you've seen somebody and you've heard their story, you can't dehumanize them, can't dismiss it. It's part of your story. So I'll share this with you maybe when I get back, or with someone I don't know quite as well. I feel like you and I have had plenty of coffee, but I have glad to be taking that back with me, just as a reminder that, if they can do it, if survivors can do it, if people who have witnessed and lived through and been dealt the worst cards, the worst of humanity, can come back and say, there's a reason to sit down and have coffee with someone who's different than me, I think we should all be able to do that.
Absolutely. That's
now
a
I'm
great
step down off my soapbox.
Yeah, no, that's a great, I mean, I think that's a great Upstander shout out right there. I mean, in terms of someone who, sort of epitomizes a lot of the character strengths that we talk about being, being an Upstander. Again, we've talked about this many, many times on the program. It doesn't take much. Like, we're not talking about necessarily lifting boulders, but just taking it within yourself to go have a cup of coffee with somebody else and hear their story. Again, we don't know what ripple effects.
The ripple effect. Yes, the ripple effect of this.
Yeah,
I mean, what am I going to
has.
do? What are you going to do now? Because you've heard the story, because you've seen the coffee. Like, what do you, it's so powerful. It is so powerful.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just got a text. Well, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, because I know you probably got to get ready to leave here in just a few seconds, but I was just going to say along those lines, I'm a firm believer that, things happen for a reason. And sometimes, from a spiritual perspective, for me, best laid plans, but, higher powers have some things differently in the plans. And maybe for this particular episode, this is what we needed to discuss and what needed to happen, and what somebody who might be listening needs to hear to adjust their perspective, give them something different to think about, something that might activate them. So I don't believe that this is in vain, even though it didn't necessarily follow the script.
It's always great. I feel like I'm always better off for the conversations. I hope the folks who are listening and watching are too. And I'm going to sign off, head to Tel Aviv, get on that plane, head to JFK, and then head back to Cincinnati, and hope that I don't have to figure out how to take shelter on the side of a highway. There are plenty of people who've been doing it for a long time. So if I do, I will. But but I'm going to head that direction. So I'll see you back in Cincinnati. Thanks everybody for listening and watching. And we'll be back next time. We promise next time. And we're going to hold you to it. And our producer, make sure that you really insist that we get to that next time for our testimonies. We're excited to share those. They're truly meaningful and deserve their space.
All right, safe travels, my friend. We'll see you when you get back in Cincinnati.
Thanks, Kevin. See y'all next time.
Let us know your thoughts on this episode. Our email is in the show notes. You can listen anytime on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or visit holocaustandhumanity.org/podcast. You can also connect with us on Instagram and TikTok at Holocaust and Humanity, and X and Facebook at CincyHHC. The Upstander Ripple Effect is a production of the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center. The center's mission is to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust inspire action today. This series is part of the Cynthia and Harold Gutman Family Center for Storytelling. Visit us in person at Historic Union Terminal in Cincinnati, Ohio, or online anytime at holocaustandhumanity.org. Managing producer is Ann Thompson. Consulting producer is Joyce Kamen. Technical producer is Robert Mills. And technical director is Josh Emerson. The opening sequence is by Ken Furman. Select music is by Kick Lee. And this is recorded at Technical Consulting Partners Studios in Cincinnati, Ohio.